Hello, everyone. What's up? Welcome to Debating Metal. I'm your host, Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, along with my co-host, Chris K. On this episode, we're going to talk about the ever-popular, the limited edition on clear wax, the one, the only, the extended play, or better known as the EP.
Extended play 45s were introduced by RCA Victor in 1952 to compete with the LP released by Columbia in 1948. They were originally vinyl records that could hold up to 7.5 minutes per side. In the early days, they were also a way to split an LP into 2 or 3 smaller 7-inch EPs. Later on, they became a way to compile several singles into one format. As time went on, EPs waned in popularity, but made a comeback in the 1970s when punk rock and the DIY subculture began. In the late 70s and 80s, EPs in heavy metal became increasingly popular as a way of releasing music for the independent and financially challenged artist.
Today, Chris and I are going to talk to you about some notable EPs, and at the end, we'll give you our big 4 metal EPs. So sit back, relax, turn it up to 11, and let the debate begin. Chris, the metal EP or the EP in general, and this one we're going to be talking about metal ones based on heavy metal. There's a long history with bands and putting out EPs and stuff like that. What's your take on it?
When I first heard of EPs, I really didn't know what they were. It was kind of foreign concept. It just said EP. I was buying them as CDs at the time because I was really buying CDs in the early 2000s. But they were still extended plays, and it really wasn't familiar with 45s. I kind of learned about those later. I remember my dad telling me about he had a bunch of Elvis 45s. The whole connection between that era and what my experience with EPs was a little bit different. So for me, it was more of like these bands would release something kind of in between albums, kind of like to remind you, hey, we're still around. Here's some new music, sometimes with live recordings or alternate versions of songs on them. So that was kind of my experience with EPs. Was more of like a kind of interim thing between big albums.
Yeah, I get that because that's really kind of one of the purposes that they used it for. And what's weird is you mentioned the fact that you were in the era of compact discs, obviously CDs, and I was at the in the era of vinyl cassettes. I was at the end of the 8-track era. I had like 2 or 3 8-tracks in my life and never really cared for them much. But the EP, on vinyl specifically, was something that was pretty popular. And when CDs came around, what was weird about that whole uh, idea is that CDs were just CDs. It wasn't like you can make it smaller, but then later on they actually made like 3-inch CDs. So they made them. They tried to make them look like they were the 7-inch vinyl 45s, right? So they were 3-inch CD singles that could only hold so much data on it, and I don't even know how long they maxed out at, but they were definitely less than half of what a CD put out.
You know
But
what I hated about those CDs too is when you put them in a tray, they were so loud. Like you would
oh
put
yeah,
it
yeah,
if you had them in like a regular little portable CD player, it wasn't bad because it would latch in. But in those trays, you'd put them in and it'd be like, "Huh?" you
yeah,
know.
because you had to put that little plastic thing around it instead of in the middle of it. Like on
Yeah.
45s or 7-inch singles, when you had a record player that only had the single little um, pointy thing in the middle. I don't even know what the hell that's called. You had to use that adapter.
Mhm.
Unless you had one of those round adapters that would go on top of that spindle, the middle spindle thing, and put and then you could put the 45 without an adapter on that because it was an adapter that was on the record player. So I had both. But the CD single, what was just dumb about the whole thing is that record companies would put out a single on a regular CD, and it's like you've got a 79-minute music CD that you've literally put 5 minutes worth of music on.
Yeah.
It was just a weird concept, and they didn't really alter their thinking along the way. Record companies have notoriously shot themselves in the foot over their lifetime. But for the person out there who really doesn't understand what an EP is, the way I define an EP is, or an EP release, from an artist, it's longer than a single, shorter than an album. Basic as it gets, and so you're going to hear us tonight, and then you'll whoever listens to other podcasts, because everybody pretty much listens to other podcasts, you'll hear those other commentators and personalities reference them. You'll hear references to full length albums, and then you'll hear EPs, you'll hear singles. And so that's why you hear the word full length, because an EP is not full length. It's just a shorter version. So that's where a lot of this terminology comes from. But in the world of metal, and especially early on, it was kind of used like a sales tool. You know, Armored Saint, Overkill, and Def Leppard, uh, Rat, Queensryche, Merciful Fate, and Iron Maiden, all those bands independently released albums. And we're going to talk about a few of them tonight, but they put up the money themselves. They gathered the money, or they had someone they knew spot them $1,000 or whatever it costs. And they went into a studio that, in some cases they did favors to get studio time so they wouldn't have to pay for it. And they recorded an album, and then, or not record an album. They just recorded whatever songs they had, that was their own songs, originals. And so some bands had 4, some bands had 5, some bands had 2, some bands had 3, and some bands like Iron Maiden had a whole bunch, but they just only recorded so many, and then they basically put it out on a 7-inch or a 12-inch. It's like an EP for the most part, and handed them out at shows, sold them at shows, sent them out to record companies. And that is how a lot of those guys got signed in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's self promotion in order to get your band name out there, some kind of recognition, and just having something that a record company could listen to.
Right, exactly. And then in a similar fashion, though, then it would be some artist that actually got signed, just because their A&R rep went to see one of their shows and said, "Hey, you know what? We're going to go ahead and sign you. We're going to give you a couple $1,000, put together a few songs. We're going to release this out so we can prepare you guys for your full length album. So your name is pretty popular right now. We want to keep that going. We want to keep that buzz going. So we're going to put out this EP while you work on your full length album." And that's pretty cool, And some bands that did that were bands like, Celtic Frost and Lizzie Borden, and even Soundgarden kind of did that to some degree, And then, like you mentioned early, it was a way for bands to keep interest in between albums. And what's weird is when you think about it compared to now and then, right? They would do that. You'd have an album released in 1985, let's say, right? And they tour for 6-7 months, and then it was time to go hit the studio. But sometimes during the tour, they would record a song live on stage, or like in sound checks, or somewhere in the sound, in the back room or whatever, or on the tour bus. And when they get off tour, it was like, all right, we're going to take a break, but man, let's get this song out real quick. Or they would submit it to the record company, and they would put out a small EP. Thinking about that, before the next album came out, and the next album would come out, if they released it in April of 85, then the first album, so let's say the next album would come out in like September of 86, right? But in between that, they wanted to keep their name out there. Now think about that concept compared to today. You got bands today in metal. And let's just talk about some of our classic bands. Metallica, 8 years in between albums. Iron Maiden, 6, 7, 8 years in between albums. Right now, the new Anthrax album that's supposed to come out later this year would be 8 years since they released their last full length album. That's insane. I mean, you would have thought maybe they throw something out there and say, hey fans, have some music. Metallica teased it a bunch of times, it never happened. Anthrax put out, Kings in Scotland or something like that. They also put out the live album for their 40th anniversary. So I get that. That's what some bands did. They would put live albums out there.
Mm-hmm.
But this was, the EP was a way to put one or two songs and keep our name out there. So, and bands that did that were like, King Diamond did that. It's kind of like Metallica did that with the 598 EP, which we'll probably mention later. That was,
Spoiler
Jason.
alert.
Yeah, Jason's in the band, right? So let's go ahead and get him in the studio, see what he's like. Shit like that. So anyhow, without further ado, let's get on with talking about some really notable EPs. And before we get started, just let me mention for anybody out there who, after you get through this episode, you can go back to what I called at the time the interim episode. It was released in March 27th, 2023. And it was me by myself because our dear friend and my co-host Chris K was ill and we needed to put out a show. So I took the mic for about, 35, 40 minutes or something like that. And I talked about debut EPs from 80s metal bands. And so that episode included Lizzie Borden, Rat, Armored Saint, Celtic Frost, and Merciful Fate. So we might not talk about those tonight. But anyway, Chris, why don't you go ahead and give us your first one?
Okay. I think a good one to start off with is Opiate by Tool. So this was actually the first Tool album that I owned. I had a sampler that had a bunch of new metal and alternative metal and that kind of stuff that my local record store had given me. I've mentioned them a few times in the past. Diamond had records in Houston. They're no longer around, but at the time they were like the place to go for metal, and they were doing some kind of promotion. They gave out 2 discs of sampler, and I had found a few bands from that, and the first Tool song that I had ever heard was something off of I think it was Sober, off of Undertow. And so I went to the store looking for that album. I couldn't find it, and I did find Opiate, so I picked that up. And it was a really cool album. Obviously, like still kind of in their early days and more kind of silly songs, and there was some stuff that was kind of more focused on like censorship, religion, and then just like they had songs like Jerk Off and um Cold and Ugly. I really liked Hush. It's a 6 song album. It was 26 minutes. I mean that was pretty solid for me at the time. Couple tracks were live, Cold and Ugly and Jerk Off. Then there was Opiate, the I think it was like 8.5 minutes, and there was a hidden song at the end. Starts at like the last 6 minutes of the album. It was really cool. It really got me into the band, and by the time I found Undertow, like that was like the perfect introduction because it gave like a lot of attitude. It was definitely more. I wouldn't say like punky, but it was more underground, I think, than some of the stuff that came later. And if you're new getting into like a band and kind of like transitioning from more like heavy metal, I thought this was a good like introduction to the band because some of the stuff that came later, like Lateralis, it's more um what's the word I'm looking for here? It's kind of out there, hippie-ish, whereas this was more in the same kind of vein of my attitude at the time, I thought. So good introduction to the band.
My first introduction to Tool came on MTV, watching Sober, on the video on MTV. So, and that's how long. I mean, shit, they start. Opiate came out 91, 90,
Opiate was 92.
92, and then Sober was 94, I think, or Undertow. Excuse me,
Undertow was 93. Yeah.
93. So, I mean, that was still MTV was still relatively a thing back then,
I mean, I was pretty
and
young. Yeah, I want to say I would have had to have been about 10 years old. I was not driving
mm,
at that time. Yeah.
so it's pretty wild when I think about it, because it was like Tool doesn't seem like one of those bands that's been around for that long, because they only had what, 5 full length albums, and it's kind of like that's not a lot, but they've been around for fucking 30 years. It's nuts. So
Yeah, I mean they had a pretty long hiatus,
yeah,
but from like 92 to 2001 was really their heyday, right? And then 10,000 Days came out 5 years later. There was kind of that gap in between there too, right? So like 10 years of solid like production, and then a little bit of more spaced out, and then a pretty long gap. It was like 13 years before the next album. So
yeah, that was pretty wild. But yeah, I like Tool, and I listen to Opiate today, in fact, and it's definitely exactly how you described it, where there's a lot of youthfulness to it, but
exactly.
you can hear in those songs some of the stuff that would come later, and it just their sound, while it was still technically primitive, it was the Tool sound that you would eventually become familiar with on albums like Lateralis, and 10,000 Days. So it's pretty interesting, how that album is so all over the place, but yet very kind of it's Tool, you know?
Yeah, it's a bit heavier than pretty much anything else they put out. So like each album to me became progressively less heavy, but not like in a bad way. They became more mature over time.
Right, exactly. All right, so for me, the choices that I make tonight are going to be predominantly more classic bands, and that's just who I am. But I am going to try and talk about a couple of newer EPs. But my first one is going to be Anthrax, "Armed and Dangerous." It came out in 1985. This was the EP that introduced Joey Belladonna to the metal world. It also introduced Frank Bello, but it wasn't as much of a that wasn't as much of a thing, because Frank Bello played toward the end of the tour, because Dan Lilker got thrown off, and was fired. So there were some shows that Frankie had already played, but um, Joey was kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of hired out of the blue, and so they brought him into the recording studio, and they sang these songs. I mean, put it this way: Joey was not a metalhead. you
Hmm.
know, realistically, he's not a metalhead. I think he kind of morphed into that over the years, and became a big Dio fan, and stuff like that. But realistically, he sings in a Journey cover band. So that's the kind of guy he is. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that at all, but it's very unique. And at the time in 1985, when there was no such thing as posers in metal, it was just weird that he got the gig. So that was his first appearance. It introduced 2 new songs, um, "Armed and Dangerous" and the song "Panic." Now, the funny thing was, is if you look at the LP on the back, it says, or not the LP, but the artwork on the EP, it says, uh, "New studio or studio track," and then it has a little asterisk that says, "Previews of new songs from their upcoming album," or something like that. And Panic never made it onto Spreading the Disease. And it also had a cover of God Save the Queen and some live tracks, which was a pretty cool 5-song EP. Um, and it really was a very cool, and I personally, to throw this out there, this version of Armed and Dangerous to me is better than the one that's on Spreading the Disease. And for years, since that time up until probably last year, my understanding was that those was two different recordings. Last year, I read something where that is actually a remix of what's on Spreading the Disease. And I'm shocked if it is, because to me, they sound like two different songs. I
Hmm.
mean, it's the same song, but they sound like two completely different recordings.
Yeah.
So, so I'm not buying it that it's the same recording remix, because to me, there's just not a lot of similarities. But I could be wrong, because to me, the one on Armed and on the EP sounds 100 times better than what came out on Spreading the Disease. But I didn't produce that one. So
Yeah.
that, that's what that is. What do you got next?
Okay. I guess let's talk about the Iron Maiden, the Soundhouse, the Iron Maiden, the Soundhouse tapes. It was released in 1979. It's a 3-track EP that has Iron Maiden, Invasion, and Prowler. This was, the first release from Iron Maiden. It's a bit rougher in sound than like what they would release on their actual albums, but I think it's a really nice snapshot of the time, because this is, the lineup of Paul Di'Anno, Dave Murray, Paul Cairns on guitar, although he's uncredited, Steve Harris on bass guitar, and Doug Sampson on drums. So kind of
Drugs.
a that's funny. We're probably all on drugs, but yeah, I mean, there was only 5,000 copies of it released. I mean, it's pretty valuable if you do have a copy. There's been a copy sold for 1,750 euros on auctions. So, I mean, that's pretty crazy. This was kind of like coming out of the punk rock peak, and I mean, if you've seen or if you lived in during the time, like, this was when Iron Maiden was really like gaining a lot of steam. People were going to the shows, bringing dummy guitars that they could air guitar along with and play. Like, this was that era of, like, the inception of this band, and just kind of having that history behind it and its importance kind of in the scene of metal, um and not really being widely distributed. At least now you can find all this stuff, which, I mean, think about it. At the time, like, imagine you had a copy when this was at its peak, but like now you can get a digital copy and listen to this stuff. So it's such a different world than it used to be. It's crazy.
It is. You know, I. It's funny you say it that way, because, you know, when when I get into a band and they have a history, right? So I got into Iron Maiden. They were already 3 years into their. Well, they were more than 3 years into their history, but into their recording history, they were already 3 years into it. Get into Metallica, they already released two albums.
Hmm.
Get into Megadeth, they already released their debut album, and so you go back and you want to catch all this stuff, right? And this stuff is available, but you hear about, like, for instance, the Rat EP that came out. When Rat became popular, they reissued it with a different back cover, same front cover. So it was still readily available, and you could still get the original one. And it wasn't like you were getting it for, oh, it's a collector's item, it's on eBay. That shit didn't
No. Yeah.
exist, right? So you would buy it. Okay, so if it originally went for $5, you're getting it for maybe $10 or $7 or whatever it is, right? The reissue is $6.99 or whatever. But the funny thing, like with the Soundhouse tapes, that's one of those where it's like, all right, so there's 5,000 issued. It's very similar to Motley Crue's Too Fast for Love. They put it out themselves. They sold 1,000 copies, and that was it. It's never to be seen again, right? However, Motley Crue reissued the vinyl and stuff like that. Iron Maiden has never reissued or even attempted to issue the Soundhouse tapes, other than they featured two songs, I believe it's two songs, on the Best of the Beast CDs. It was a double disc compilation. And I believe it's 4 LPs. It's either 3 or 4 LP version of Best of the Beast, and it included all 4 songs. And when I say 4, because the release only had 3, but there was 4 songs recorded at the sessions. Strange World, which ended up on Iron Maiden, was recorded at those sessions and never released, and
Yep.
it came out on the Best of the Beast, which is pretty cool. So you can get it digitally, right? But you'll never get it as the Soundhouse tapes. The funny thing about the Soundhouse tapes is I would not spend a dime on the Soundhouse tapes today, because you cannot prove to me that was not made in someone's backyard. Okay. And if someone sits there and shows me a pristine copy of the Soundhouse tapes, you're out of your fucking mind. I'm no way. I just don't believe it.
I mean, it would be cool to have for sure.
It would be cool to have.
Item, but yeah, listening to it, yeah. I mean, it's a nice, landmark of that time, right? So one thing I did want to say about it before we move on to the next one.
Mhm.
So basically, it received distribution because of it receiving play from a DJ named Neil K.
Right.
So basically impressed with the demo, like wanted to play it so help the band really gain recognition, and it made Prowler reach #1 on the Soundhouse charts, which is just crazy to think about. So like the Soundhouse tapes is really in a big way responsible for Iron Maiden becoming, as big of a band, like not responsible, but like an important factor, and them becoming as big of a band as they did. Because like a lot like we've gone over, especially during the new album era, like there was a lot of bands that put out some really cool stuff that never got anywhere because record companies really screwed them over. And Iron Maiden's one of the really fortunate ones that, beyond having great music, they also had a little bit of luck and some good support behind them.
And that's the really big key. And I'm going to talk about a new album band next, but that is the big key. You got to have good songs. That's the first thing. You have to have good songs, but you can't just have one good song. You can't really just have 2 good songs. But if you have 2 good songs, more than likely you're going to have a third good song. And the reason I say it like that is because anybody can step on a pile of shit one day and come up with a really good song. Okay, and have that's the day of their life, and they make this great song. But if you have to create that over and over and over again, then if you're good at it, obviously you become rich and famous. If you're not good at it, then you get one hit wonder and you retire. So Iron Maiden. So that's what set Iron Maiden apart. I mean, no one is more motivated than Steve Harris, and said, he's gonna make it, or he's gonna die trying. And so Iron Maiden was, I mean, they were special from the start, and they set themselves ahead of the pack with the way that they did things. And then once they got Rod Smallwood as their manager, it was over for everybody. I mean, the fact that Rod Smallwood's still their manager to this day is pretty amazing. So
Yeah, I mean, I would, when you said that he's nobody's more motivated than him, I probably believe that. you know,
I mean, I don't even think the other 5 guys in this band is as motivated as he is
yeah,
when it comes to Iron Maiden. But I mean, they're all pretty motivated. But I mean, this guy is the living, breathing epitome of what it is to be Iron Maiden, and that's great. I love it. Good for him. All right. So speaking of another new album band, and one that had a tremendous amount of talent that kind of left the new album scene behind, Def Leppard released the Def Leppard EP in 1979. This is their debut release, again, done independently on their own record label. And when you listen to those songs, I mean, the first 2 songs on the album are Totally new album. Ride into the sun and get your rocks off, especially get your rocks off. Here's what's set to me after listening to this, and I really gave this a good listen to the other day. The song The Overture. The first 2 minutes are kind of like an acoustic kind of passage with Joe Elliott singing. To me, if you listen to that, that sounds like something that they wrote on Hysteria or on Armageddon or even, as early as, say, maybe Pyromania. It sounds really good up until the point where the rest of the band starts. Then you can tell it's low budget, but it's pretty clear. And it's just his singing sounds so much more mature than it did on Ride into the Sun and Get Your Rocks Off. It sounds like the Joe Elliott that we know today, which is pretty impressive. Very similar to how Aerosmith doesn't sound like Aerosmith on the first album. It wouldn't come until albums later that you heard Steven Tyler sound like the Steven Tyler that he is. The overture is pretty cool. So I mean, the song itself is okay, but that first 2 minute intro is pretty awesome in showcasing what they can do. And so that this EP was very significant for them in their history. And they have re-released the songs very similar to all the other bands who released their history, digitally on some kind of box set, blah 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 type of thing. Have you listened to it?
I haven't.
It's pretty cool. I mean, Get Your Rocks Off. I mean, that song is on their first album, On Through the Night. Ride into the Sun, pretty cool song. It's a slower song than Get Your Rocks Off, but it's a good song. It's a good rock song. And then, like I said, Overture, the first 2 minutes are the best part for me, and then it turns into a new album song straight up. So
I'll have to give it a listen.
I will, and actually they feature Overture on Through the Night as well. The one that didn't make it was Ride into the Sun, which is kind of weird. So, but yeah, give it a listen when you get a chance. It's pretty cool. I mean, it's very, like I said, very new album sounding, but you can tell that there's talent there.
All right.
All right. So what's up next for you?
So I'm going to mention one kind of briefly. So there was a very brief project, and unfortunately, it's never come back around. But it was called Pyrithian. This was Tim Lambesis' last project before he ended up going to prison. So there's a negative connotation to that, but I am a believer in people turning their life around and kind of coming back from bad things. So I'm not going to dwell on that, but I do want to talk about the album because it's a 3-song EP. It came out in 2013. It's called The Burden of Sorrow, and it is extremely heavy and has really awesome songs. The first track, The Invention of Hatred, I absolutely love. It is one of those that it just like if you are working out, put that on. It's gonna be an awesome track to listen to. Then there's Bleed Out and Rest in the Arms of Paralyzed Beast. I love both of those tracks. I wish that he would do more with it. Basically, he teamed up with members of Alagion and the Famine, and they put this out in 2013. I said the last thing. There was also Triple Brutal, which he was working on with Austrian Death Machine, if you're familiar with them. But that's more of like a joke kind of album. Like the Austrian Death Machine, they're really cool riffs, but he's doing an Arnold Schwarzenegger impression through parts of the album and stuff like that. So I really wasn't kind of thinking of that as like a serious thing. But yeah, definitely check out Pyrithian if you get a chance. You can find it in digital format. It's kind of buried, unfortunately, because of the circumstances of the time, and it never really got like a lot of play. But it's freaking awesome, and it's one of those hidden gems you should definitely check out.
I believe you had mentioned Pyrithian before, and I listened to one of their songs, but it was a long time ago. It was like in the middle of like year 2 that we were doing the show.
Yeah, it's been a minute since I brought it up, but I do always kind of want to bring it up because it is so good and it is so underappreciated.
But did you know that Austrian Death Machine is back?
I did know that actually. Yeah,
Yeah, so they dropped a video that was inspired by the Terminator, and they're releasing their first album in over a decade.
yeah. That was. I mean, I don't get me wrong. I love Austrian Death Machine. It's a lot of fun, but that was not the project I wanted to come back. So
Yeah, all right. I like I said, I've heard one. I just don't remember. I mean, dude, it's been like 2.5 years. We probably talked about it the last time.
yeah.
So I listened to it back then. I probably thought it was cool. I just I don't remember. All right. Moving on to my next one. It's Queensryche with the Queensryche EP, the first release by Queensryche, and again, that's independent release, independently released. Excuse me. To the point where Jeff Tate wasn't even officially in the band yet. The band had a different singer. He quit, I think, or fired or whatever. They asked him to sing on the project because they were recording these songs. He did. It came out great. He decided to stick with the band, and good thing that he did. But as you all know, I mean, if anybody out there follows Queensryche, this is, you put the, let's put it this way: if you're listening to it on vinyl, you put the needle down, and you see this, you hear this buildup of the first song on the record called "Queen of the Reich." It's enough said. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That song is awesome, and I mean, if you're a Queensryche fan out there, this song is just this is. I mean, it's called Queen of the Reich. It is the namesake of the band, right? And over the years, Jeff began to play it less and less, sing it less and less, and not even sing it with the enthusiasm that it deserves. So much so that when he was fired and Todd LaTorre, and this is actually before he was fired, when Todd LaTorre hooked up with the guys in Queensryche to make the band called Rising West because they were on a break from Queensryche and they wanted something to do and they needed some money to you know uh, to make make ends meet. They put together Rising West, and they had been recommended this singer named Todd LaTorre. He basically gelled. I think he met Michael Wilton at a NAMM show. They gelled, came out, they did the show, and the first song they did was Queen of the Reich. And that dude pulled it off so well. It was over for Jeff Tate at that point. And it's one of the songs I still play, and I love it. Every time I hear it, it's just amazing. The fact that they could still play it, and because Todd can sing like Jeff, and he can sing those notes that Jeff can't sing anymore or can't hit anymore. It's just great to hear that song. I love that album. It also features Knight Rider. It features The Lady Wore Black. Um, and then it also contains the song Blinded on it. So, I mean, all four songs are really pretty cool. I mean, Lady Wore Black, really like that song. It's a ballad before ballads were a thing. It's kind of like, it's like almost like we consider like a progressive power ballad. It's like I said, it's not supposed to be a sweet love song, but it's definitely slow and moody, and then picks up and it slows back down. Really, really cool song. Like I said, ballad before ballads were a thing in metal, but it was still very, very cool song. I love that release.
Yeah, it's really cool, and it's a lot. I would say more metal than some of the stuff that would come, like as in like just heavy metal. The stuff that came later obviously introduced a lot more progressive elements. So if you're not as into progressive metal, but you just like the typical heavy metal, it's a really strong release that I think like even non-progressive fans could get into.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, but there's still some progressiveness to it,
Of
but it's
course, but
it's
less.
not. Yeah, it's much less. It's more straightforward than the rest of their stuff.
Yeah, like Queen of the Reich itself is like just an awesome heavy song.
Oh, jeez, don't even get me started. All right, what's next for you?
Well, let's talk about an early extreme metal release. You said you mentioned Celtic Frost last time, but let's talk about Tom Warrior's band before that, which was Hellhammer with Apocalyptic Raids. This was released in 1984. There was a re-release in 1990 with a couple more tracks on it, but the main one we're going to talk about is the original Apocalyptic Raids. It's kind of a rough listen, based on the equipment used at the time. But again, it's like a perfect snapshot of that time period. Basically took elements of bands like Black Sabbath and bands that came around like after that, and a lot of the speed metal that was coming out, and so kind of combined like thrash black metal sound, before really black metal was a thing, but some of that early like Venom and Black Sabbath and stuff like that. It's made a really heavy, moody, just awesome sounding album. And then this band just evaporated. Tom Warrior did end up making Celtic Frost just a couple years later. But this is kind of like the only legacy of Hellhammer. And it's four awesome tracks. The Third of the Storms, Evoke Damnation, then Massacre, which when I was a kid and I saw it, I thought it was mascara, but that's kind of weird. They had to use mascara for their corpse paint. But Triumph of Death and Horus Aggressor, really awesome stuff. For me, like being, pretty young when I got into extreme metal, this was one of the ones that I didn't have a copy of, but I had a burned copy of that from a friend. Just could not find music back then the same way. And, you had to do what you had to do sometimes to get a copy of things. And so I did find this eventually and had it in my collection. Again, from my local record store. I think I paid a bit of a premium to get a copy of this, but very cool. I had the 1990 re-release. I did not have the original, but I would love to, because it's also one of those that, like, it would be such a cool piece on the wall too, like if you have the vinyl, because it's an awesome album cover.
Yeah. Which album cover are you talking about?
What do you mean?
I thought I thought there was one that was censored. That's why.
Yeah, it's a little inappropriate.
A little. I remember this well after the fact. I was already into Celtic Frost. I had heard about Hellhammer, never really heard it or saw it until I worked at the record store in 1990. I think it came in, the Apocalyptic Rage import came in 91. And I quickly grabbed it, recorded it, listened to it, thought it was pretty cool. Um, it's definitely the inspiration to black metal. I mean, that's how bad it sounds.
It's one of them for sure. Like
Yeah.
if you're talking about Venom, you got to talk about Hellhammer as well.
Yeah, and it was funny because we, on the last episode we did where we were talking about the 10, the 10 most important bands in the history of metal. I mean, and I put down was it Venom and Celtic Frost together or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, really, it should have been more like Venom and Hellhammer, because or Venom and Tom Warrior or Tom Fisher, because it was his vision with Hellhammer, and then the Hellhammer was getting such bad reviews and people did not like them for whatever reason. That's the reason why they
Yeah,
ended up
it's got a
disappearing.
1/10 in the collector's guide to heavy metal. Like, but I don't see why. Other than it was just shocking at the time.
Right, and shocking, and it sounded like crap, and it's all that stuff. And it
But
was
then
one of,
sounding like crap took off
oh
in
yeah.
that part of the world.
Like, hey, this is cool. Yeah, and no, and there's nothing, you're gonna there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you like, but they had bad criticism for years for this album. And what ended up happening was when when Tom made Celtic Frost, that bad criticism followed along, and people were lumping Celtic Frost with Hellhammer, even though there are similarities, but the songwriting was much better and the recordings were drastically better.
Yeah.
But yeah. So if you want to put the LP on your wall, you're more than welcome to. You're just going to get some funny looks from people.
from the dog.
All right. I'm going to mention kind of along those lines, not really. Overkill and their first EP, their first release, again independently released, 4-song album. Was their debut. Just the Overkill is a big black cover with the bright green Overkill on the top. It featured the songs "Rotten to the Core," "Overkill," "Fatal If Swallowed," and the song "The Answer." All the songs except for "The Answer," so 3 out of the 4 songs would reappear later on different recordings. Where it was "Rotten to the Core" and "Overkill" would appear on the first Overkill album. What the hell is it called?
Feel the Fire.
Feel the Fire. Jesus Christ, where's my head today? And then Fatal If Swallow would appear on Taking Over. I mean, the songs are produced okay. They're demos essentially, and there's such an energy about these songs, and it's really cool. And that all these albums that we're talking about, the reason why these bands got signed: Iron Maiden, Queensryche, Overkill, all these bands, they're still around today. And you hear these early recordings, and you understand why. The energy that's just comes out of those records is amazing, and this is no different. And it's just just to see the early years of these bands is pretty impressive. This album is pretty cool. I really like Rotten to the Core. The version that's on Feel the Fire is much better sounding. Even though Feel the Fire pretty much itself was also a rough recording, in general, compared to what Taking Over and future albums would sound like. But I mean, these are really good songs. So the EP would be later reissued as part of bonus tracks to a reissued "Fuck You" EP. Now, the "Fuck You" EP was pretty cool. I had never seen anything like that when it came out, and I'm like, I have to have this. And part of the reason why was because you saw a record in the record bin in 1985 that was covered in a plastic garbage bag. Or actually, excuse me, 1987. And when I say plastic garbage bag, it was a thick black, like hefty bag that was heat sealed around the album. And the reason why was because the album's name is "Fuck You," or the EP's name is "Fuck You," and it features a big middle finger. It kind of greasy looking too, but a big middle finger on the front. And when you listen to you buy it, you listen to it. The song is pretty good. Contains some samples at the end because in 1987 that was the thing to do, was to throw samples on your songs, sort of like Anthrax's "I'm the Man." So when they reissued the EP for "Fuck You," they changed the name to "Fuck You and Then Some." It was reissued in 1997. The "Then Some" was additional live tracks along with the Overkill EP. And listening to it today, I almost feel like they recorded it off the record. I don't think the digital copy is off the master tapes, unless what I have recorded is from a download that I got that someone recorded the record. But noticing that the track said 7, 8, 9, 10 or something like that, that was the original, the EP release for "Fuck You and Then Some." let's see, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I don't know. I could have done something weird or something like that, but my version, it sounded like it was a record. I heard pops. I heard, not skips, but you heard record pops. And I'm like listening to it on my phone. So I know it's something with the recording. But anyway, it was pretty cool. I've got to check it out more. Um, if you get a chance to buy "Fuck You" and then some, you'll get the full out the full EP on there.
Okay.
Have you heard it?
Um, I've heard the Overkill EP, like the original version. I don't know if I've ever heard the the Fuck You and Then Some version of it. I might have when we were doing some research,
I mean, it's the
for
same thing. It's just
yeah. But yeah, with the I mean, I've never heard like the live tracks or anything like that.
right. Okay,
So, um, but yeah, I've heard it when we were doing an Overkill episode earlier. So
cool.
that's a band that it's interesting to me because I'm much more of a fan of their later career than their early career. It's just
So you're
so
more of a fan of the stuff now, right?
yeah.
See,
I
which is funny
actually
because the stuff now to me is much more similar and closer to the stuff back then. It's that middle period. Um,
agreed for sure. It's just the sound quality,
oh
and
yeah,
I like the riffs of the modern day too. Like, don't get me wrong, the like when we've seen them live, they sound great with the older tracks. It's just the recordings themselves that aren't very good. It's harder to get into when you weren't there.
right. Gotcha. All right, what do you got next?
All right, so I'm gonna go over Children of Bottom. They had the Trashed, Lost, and Strung Out EP in 2004. I remember this one very well because I did find it again at my local record store. I was so excited about it because it had a cover of Bed of Nails from Alice Cooper, which is one of the few Alice Cooper songs I actually know very well. But I had heard the single and a online clip before getting it, and so this was one of my favorite bands of all time. So obviously, any release was exciting to me at the time. But I did have the EP version. I thought I had the single, but I had the EP version because I had the one with Knuckle Duster. Which, funny enough, they pulled that song off this EP and re-recorded it for the last album that they released. So even if you didn't hear it on this EP, a newer version of it was used on the final album because Alexi had not heard it in a while, and when he heard it, they were kind of going over some old material. He was like, "Man, that's a cool song. We should use that." And then one of the other band members was like, "We did use it. We had it on the EP." But so it's kind of funny. And then it had a cover of "She Is Beautiful" from Andrew WQA. I'm not as familiar with his stuff, but because he's really more of like part of the party rock scene. Um, you know, but I would say like that was a really cool cover. And then it had some videos on it back when that was a big thing. Like you put the CD in your computer and watch a really low quality video of the stuff. But one thing that was cool was it had like a night out with the band, and they were like all over the city and in Helsinki, and it was just like when you're a fan of a band, like, and you don't really have the opportunity to see them live and do stuff like any of that kind of stuff that just makes you feel closer to them. Like for me at the time in 2004, I thought it was awesome.
I still like stuff like that
Yeah.
when you get to see bands outside of their element.
Yeah, just kind of hanging out. Like
Uh-huh.
I think they were like sledding and stuff like that, and it was kind of cool.
Yeah, that stuff is always cool. I like that stuff. I even like the lo-fi videos that you can get on the back of a CD.
Hmm.
uh, I, for one, have not heard this. It's one that I want to listen to. I have it available to listen to, so I just haven't done it yet.
Well, I
Um,
think everything here is re-released on something or other. Because
right.
there's the covers, and like I said, Knuckle Dusters on the last album, and then Trust, Lost, and Strung Out is on the Was it on Are You Dead Yet? Yeah, it was on Are You Dead Yet? So, you know, it was more of like a really cool thing at the time, but I'm pretty sure everything on it has been re-released in some capacity.
Cool. Very good. All right. So for me, my next one, I'm going to talk about. Let's see here. There's a couple of cool things here. One that stands out to me the most, and I didn't, and then this will be real quick too. I didn't do I didn't choose anything, and you and I talked about this. Anything that was just fully live. Like there are plenty of live EPs out there, just kind of like to throw something out there for the fans. But the one that really stands out to me the most is one from Ozzy, came out in 1981, and it's called Ozzy Live EP, and it is available almost. I think some people called it like a Mr. Crowley single, but I have the one that's called the Ozzy Live EP, and what it is it has three songs. Has Mr. Crowley and Suicide Solution live. Suicide Solution plays all the way up until it gets to the Randy Rhoads guitar solo, and then it fades out. But what makes this album really unique and really a collector's item is it has a song called "You Said It All" that has never been recorded by Ozzy on any album. This came out because they were on tour. They were getting popular, and the record label wanted some new music, so the band was going to do what eventually would become Blizzard, not Blizzard, Jesus Christ, Diary of a Madman. But they were still on tour, and they didn't want to pull them off tour, so the band said, "Well, we have this song," and it was a Brandy song, and they played it. They literally rehearsed it at a sound check and recorded it that night or the next night, something like that. And that's the only recording that exists of that song.
Mm.
So that's what makes it really special. And so I think it's pretty cool. So I had it on a regular vinyl, has a picture of Ozzy on the front and it says live EP. And then a friend of mine who was in the business, he was also in the record stores, but he worked for a distributor before he worked at the store. And I went to his house one day for something, and we were looking through his collection, and he had a picture disc version of this album. And I'm like, dude, let me get that. And he goes, no. And I knew he wasn't going to give it to me. So I was just kind of like, oh, man. I go, what do you want for it? And he was like, I'm not going to sell it. Well, probably a year or so later, for like my birthday or for something, or for his birthday, he was just deciding to feel generous. He brought it in and gave it to me. So I have it. Pretty cool thing. He has since passed away, and so I always point to the sky when I think about that, because that was a pretty cool gift that he gave me, and that I always enjoy.
Yeah,
So
that's a
that's
nice story. Yeah.
yeah. So if you ever get I don't even know if they've released it on any of the box sets or anything like that. I really don't remember. I would have thought that maybe that the Aussie camp would have put this out, but I guess because they're trying to limit the amount of music is out there by Lee Kerslake and Bob Daisley, it is not on any of the anniversary reissues of the first two albums. But anyway, if you ever get it, it's pretty cool. It's out there. What do you got
Maybe
next?
maybe someday when Sharon passes away, we'll get all the good music again.
When Sharon, so I don't know if you ever read this recently, but if Sharon passes away, or no, if one of the two of them become incapacitated, they have a
Uh-huh.
suicide pact that they would go to some place and then they would basically be put to sleep.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, they've already talked to the kids about it, so it's a really weird, interesting thing.
I guess they're going to Canada.
It's somewhere in Europe,
Yeah,
so
mm,
who knows?
fun. All right.
Next.
All right. So I'm going to talk about In Flames in a trio of EPs, starting with Subterranean. So In Flames, it was really more of a project when the band started. there was kind of a little bit of a revolving lineup. Um, Basically, it was a project for Jesper Stromblad. He ended up becoming the rhythm guitarist for the band, but on their first album, he was the drummer. And he wrote all the music, and he probably, was this was more of like just a uh, attempt for him to work with other musicians and that kind of stuff. But then he released Subterranean in 1995, and really more of the band's future lineup was in place by this point. Johan Larsson was on bass. Jesper Stromblad moved over to rhythm guitar. Glenn Lundstrom was lead guitar, and Henke Force was the lead vocals. Um, and he actually had various drummers. Daniel Erlandson, who's known for playing with Arch Enemy, and Anders Givart from Dark Tranquillity. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing any of these names. You can feel free to correct me. I'll be happy to learn. But um, I've been a fan of all of these bands, and I listened to Subterranean actually yesterday, and I had forgotten how much I love this EP. Songs like "Stand Ablaze," that the title track "Subterranean." I love the instrumental "Biosphere." I'm sorry, "Timeless." That leads into "Biosphere." "Biosphere" being my favorite track on the album. Um, I had forgotten how much I love this EP. I used to listen to it all the time when I was in high school. I ended kind of like shifted more over to the Clayman era of the band, and I really haven't listened to this heavily in maybe even in its like entirety in years. And I'm glad I did. I mean, it was a great experience. It's 20-minute EP. Some of the songs are about 4 or 5 minutes long. Like I said, there's an instrumental on there. It's about 1 minute. I'm sorry, 1 minute and 46 seconds. So it's a nice little lead into the last track. And if you get the 2003 reissue, it's got Dead Eternity, The Inborn Lifeless, Eye of the Beholder, and Rooters, Murders in the Room Morgue. Now, what's interesting about those is Eye of the Beholder. That's a weird cover to me. That's a Metallica song for those of you who don't immediately recognize it. Um, it's got clean vocals, and this was kind of before uh, really anything else that they did. It was from some kind of Metallica tribute album. And then Murders of the Rue Morgue was the one of the first ones I believe with Anders Frieden on it, who became and is currently their singer. So it's a really cool EP. I'm not really talking much about the reissue, but the original version I'm a huge fan of. And then Black Ash Inheritance, that was from 1997. It was the second EP they released, and it was after they did the Jester Race, which is one of my favorite albums with the band. Basically, they had the song "Glass Disarm Their Davids." It fits right along and feels like an extra track from the Jester Race. They've got Gyroscope, which is a kind of a preliminary version of the song that would occur on their next album, Horacle. So it's a different version of that song. If you listen to them next to each other, you can definitely see some distinct aspects of each version. There's Acoustic Melody, which is a melody of, or I'm sorry, a medley of Artifacts of the Black Rain, Dead Eternity, and which Jotun was from Horacle. So kind of this was a lot of ideas that they were coming up with in between the two albums, and you can see like how one led into the other. And then a live version of Behind Space, which I mean, Behind Space is on like 4 or 5 different albums from In Flames. They really pushed that song in their early career. It's a great track. Um, I'm just always so curious why like that track though appears on so many things. It's on the original album. It's on Black Ash Inheritance. There's a re-released version of it on Colony, like a re-recorded version of it. They just kept trying to get it over like a wrestler. Um, And then the last EP that I'm going to mention is Trigger. Now, Trigger came out in the time when I was kind of losing interest in Flames because I wasn't as big of a fan of Reroute to Remain. Um, that was kind of a disappointing album for me because it was coming right off of Clayman, 2 years later, and um, it was a drastic difference in sound. I didn't like the recording quality very much. Um, you know, Trigger was used in Freddy versus Jason, so this was kind of like a promotion to kind of go on that. It was a shorter version of the main track or the track that was on the album. They had "Watch Them Feed," which I thought was a pretty cool track as an extra one that didn't make it onto any album. And then a cover of Genesis's "Land of Confusion," which I actually do really like that version of it. And Cloud Connected, which I was never a fan of that song. They did a club remix, which is just absolutely terrible. And then Moon Shield from the Jester Race, they did a C64 soundboard karaoke version, which uh, weird, but they've done a few soundboard versions of songs since, like MIDI kind of style tracks. So something they've kind of continued doing over the years. But anyway, for me, for a while, Trigger was kind of like the bookend for my time listening to In Flames. I did end up liking some of the stuff that did come a bit later. But I remember at the time thinking, okay, I guess I'm kind of done with In Flames. And I felt a bit sad at the time. But what was so this to me is also one of those moments like we mentioned earlier where a band would release an album, then an EP, then an album, then an EP, and it was kind of like to keep the interest, but it was also because they were trying to break into the U.S. scene from Gothenburg, Sweden. So each individual release was gaining them a little bit more notoriety, and yeah, it was just like for me, each release was just super exciting, and it just made the band even more like tangible and exciting for me because it was somebody from outside the country, and it was like not it was obviously like Iron Maiden is from Europe and Judas Priest is from Europe, but this was like when the Gothenburg scene was kind of making its way into the US. For me, it was almost like getting a imported video game or something. Like it was just this kind of forbidden material that like I was like nobody else knows about this, you know?
Yeah, and that's like, how a lot of kids felt with, the new wave of British heavy metal when stuff came out.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So that was kind of like my new wave of British heavy metal moment.
That's cool. I mean, I for the longest time, I never knew anything about this Gothenburg scene and the movement of melodic death metal. No clue whatsoever. I guess I was embroiled in new metal, at the time, and the new wave of
Yeah, that makes sense.
American heavy metal and metalcore, which I didn't really adopt. There was some of it, when I went to Ozfest and I picked up on some of those bands, which I believe In Flames played at Ozfest, and I may have seen them when they were there. But it was just like, for me, I was kind of sticking to all the bands that I knew, and my wife and I, who was my girlfriend at the time, although we went to the shows and we listened to a lot of these bands, in reality, when you go to these festivals, unless you know the bands, it's extremely hard to recognize and say, "Oh yeah, this song is different than this song is different than this song," because one, they're all heavy, they're all fast, and they're all screaming.
I can see that, yeah.
But here's the funny part. I can completely contradict myself with this statement. The reason being is Hatebreed was one of the bands that I saw, and for whatever reason, the song "Live for This" sticks out in my mind to this day. That is pretty much the only song that I listen to from Hatebreed because I just never got into them, but I love that song. And I can recognize a song anywhere, I go and listen to it and hear it. It's just pretty weird. And that song, for whatever reason, when I was at Ozfest, stuck out, and I'm like, that's a cool song. But it also may have been because it was the last song in their set, and they had the entire place cheering, screaming, "Live for this!" So that might have something to do with it.
Could be.
All right, so you mentioned a trilogy of EPs. I'm going to talk about a trilogy of EPs, or what was supposed to be a trilogy of EPs. Stone Sour, and I'm going to refer to this as the Burbank EPs. They released 2 EPs that was supposed to be a third, or there was supposed to be a trilogy of them, and so they ended up not releasing the third one, and I don't know why, but it would have been cool had they done that, because it was the whole premise behind these were cover songs, which is pretty cool, but it ended up not getting released. Back in 2015, they released an EP called Meanwhile in Burbank. So all the titles had some sort of connotation to something in pop culture. And so this one was Meanwhile in Burbank, and they did 5 cover songs: We Die Young from Alice in Chains, Heading Out to the Highway from Priest, Love Gun from Kiss, Creeping Death from Metallica, and Children of the Grave from Black Sabbath. These are all well-known songs from those bands, and Stone Sour went ahead and did a really, really solid version of each of those songs, and to the point where I listen to them on like a covers playlist all the time, and I think they're really, really good songs. Then they released their second EP later in 2015 called Straight Outta Burbank, playing off the title Straight Outta Compton, which contained another 5 cover songs: Sailing On from Bad Brains, Running Free from Iron Maiden, Gimme Shelter featuring Lizzie Hale, the Rolling Stones cover, Too Fast for Love from Motley Crue, and then Seasons in the Abyss from Slayer. Again, very cool versions, all popular songs. So it's pretty wild that they did this. And then the third one was supposed to be called No Sleep Till Burbank, which is taking off from the Beastie Boys title, No Sleep Till Brooklyn. And that was supposed to feature songs from, or a song from Van Halen, Rage Against the Machine, Violent Femmes, and AC/DC. I don't know what the 5th song was supposed to be. I don't know what the song titles were supposed to be, but those were the bands that they were supposed to cover. And rumor had it that they were doing Unchained from Van Halen. So that would have been cool.
Didn't
but,
they did an Unchained cover from
well,
Van Halen?
did they?
Yeah.
But it never came out on the EPs. It may have been a B-side.
Yeah, let me look into that real quick.
Oh, it came out on the Japanese edition of Hydrograd.
Yeah. It's if you haven't heard it, it's pretty cool.
Actually, if you look at the deluxe edition of Hydrograd, it has song from Rage Against the Machine, Soundgarden on it. So that may have been the other one that they were supposed to do.
So maybe rather than release it as an EP, they maybe the record company said we can't support that. You're gonna have to put it on like a bonus track or something.
That's a possibility. I mean, so the Van Halen cover does exist, as like I said, the Japanese bonus track. It was also on the deluxe edition of Hydrograd. Bomb Track from Rage Against the Machine is on there, and Outshine from Soundgarden. So they don't, the Violent Femmes song and the AC/DC song does not appear on here. So those songs may or may have not been recorded, but who knows? Anyway, I thought those were pretty cool EPs. I mean, it's very seldom that you get a big band. I say big band. Stone Sour is pretty popular. You don't get a band like that does relatively popular cover songs of popular bands.
Yeah.
And so that's and then put them all together in the same thing. So you might get one song, and then you get like 4 or 5 other songs that are relatively unknown. And it's like, okay, like sort of like what happened with Metallica's cover stuff. Like they have all these songs, and they throw Whiskey in a Jar for Garage Inc. And Whiskey in a Jar is pretty popular, and from Thin Lizzy, and also the song "Turn the Page" from Bob Seger is. However, it's a popular song from Bob. It's not popular in the metal scene. So, it was one of those things where Thin Lizzy and Whiskey in a Jar, that was, a Thin Lizzy song, so people were kind of familiar with it in the rock scene. But these two EPs from Stone Sour are pretty cool because of the popularity of the artists that chose.
You know who has one of the most wild covers albums is Children of Bottom with their was it Skeletons in the Closet? So they have a bunch of metal songs on there, but they also have like Britney Spears and Billy Idol and uh, Andrew WK, like I said, Pat Benatar. So it's like there's some wild stuff on there. It's really good.
Yeah, that's kind of stuff I like. Where bands are not themselves. That's
Well,
the
they're
thing.
themselves, but they're putting themselves out of their comfort zone.
Oh yeah, I mean, you look at it that way, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like they can take a Poison song like "Talk Dirty to Me" and make it like metal,
Right.
metal, not like you know hair metal.
All right. So, what's your last one for tonight?
So I'm gonna go over two EPs by Alice in Chains. You're probably familiar with them, Sap and Jar of Flies. And you specifically are definitely familiar with them, but our fans, I mean. Sap was the first one in 1992, and I really love this EP. I think over time I've really gained more and more appreciation for it. Brother got me wrong, right turn, and Am I Inside are really great, like kind of acoustic tracks. They've got some elements of, electric in there here and there, but they're really good tracks. And then Love Song obviously is just a lot of fun, more of, kind of silliness. But Got Me Wrong, I think is just absolutely great. And then Right Turn is my favorite track on that one, and that one actually features Mark Arm and Chris Cornell on vocals as well. And then Ann Wilson does vocals. Ann Wilson of uh,
Heart.
Heart fame. There we go. Does vocals on Brother and Am I Inside? So that's a really cool EP. It's not quite as well known, I guess, or impactful as Jar of Flies. It was more of kind of like in between Facelift and Dirt. Let's see. Sap was February 4th, 1992, and then Dirt was September 29th, 1992. So one of those kind of like, bringing attention to the band. And you can see like some of the maturity kind of start to come out and immaturity kind of start to come out at the same time on Sap. But then Jar of Flies came out in 1994. This was, basically the band just kind of like getting together and playing some stuff and really feeling themselves out again. But also it ended up becoming a really stellar album. It is about 10 minutes longer than Sap. It has 7 tracks on it, so it's longer than most Slayer albums. And it's got Rotten Apple, which is really cool opener. Nutshell, I Stay Away, No Excuses, Whale and Wasp, Don't Follow, and Swing on This. No Excuses and Don't Follow are the first songs that Jerry Cantrell recorded as lead vocalist. This is also the first album with Mike Inez, who replaced Mike Starr. A little bit of a change in the flow of things, and obviously Mike Starr was the first member of the band to leave. Not necessarily under his own choice, but yes and no, if you really think about it. Um, but I absolutely love Jar of Flies as my favorite Alice in Chains song on it. Nutshell, I love Don't Follow. No Excuses is absolute classic. I Stay Away's excellent. And Mike Inez really made his impression here because he was credited as a songwriter on Rotten Apple, Nutshell, I Stay Away, and Swing on This. So, really good first outing for him, as well as just being an absolutely great album.
I love this album. I have the CD, and it has fake flies in the spine of the CD. The first batch that came out had you had an assorted amount that would come with plastic flies on the spine of the CD. It's pretty cool. And then later on, I got vinyl, and the vinyl version comes with SAP. It's combined, and it's two discs. So SAP, the 4 songs are on one, like side A, and then side 2 and 3 are the songs from Jar of Flies, and then side 4 is an etching of their logo, and it's pretty freaking cool. I mean,
that is cool,
and that's back from, I want to say, the mid '90s. So it was obviously after Jar of Flies came out, but it was after kind of after the hype went down from the album. But I saw the vinyl. I'm like, oh, this is pretty cool, and bought it. So I have it. And now the 30th anniversary issue of the albums coming out, and they've got all sorts of different versions coming out now with vinyl. They got a vinyl pressing that has flies in it. I don't know. I hope those are not real flies, but they got flies in it. And then they had the colored vinyls coming out as well. So that's pretty cool. If you were able to pre-order it the other day, you got lucky because they sold out really quick. So yeah. I can't say enough about this. I love acoustic albums like this, and that's something that's really, I love when bands go outside of their normal comfort zone to do something different. Godsmack put out an acoustic EP as well back in the day. Love that album as well. But I'm going to talk about one last album here, one last band, and you may have heard of them. They're a little band from San Francisco called Metallica. And yes, I have to mention Metallica every episode, so sorry. They put out an EP. Now, not a lot of people know about this EP. Some do, some don't. It's called the Whiplash EP. And in reality, it is a overblown Jump in the Fire single. That's all it is. It has a different cover. It does not have the Cthulhu monster on the front. It actually has James, and it's kind of like a staggered version of the same picture, like 3 or 4 times on it. It has 4 songs, so it has the same thing: Jump in the Fire. It has the Seek and Destroy and Phantom Lord, which is now known as the Live at the Automat recordings. But they are not live. They were actually studio recordings where they threw some live crowd noise over it. And if you get the first box set, the Kill 'Em All box set, you can get both versions: the live, the single version, and you can get the version without the live crowd. So that's pretty cool. And then, of course, there was Whiplash. The whole reason why it's called the Whiplash EP, it was the Neck Brace remix. And to this day, I really can't tell what the difference is, other than at the end, I can hear a hi-hat count down the end of the song. That's the only difference I've noticed. Maybe there's some differences in sonics. Maybe there's some differences in the snare drum. But, I mean, there is differences. But it's not a remix that we know remixes to be today. Gotcha. It is very, very close to the original. There's some, like I said, very minute sonic differences, sonic qualities. But when you talk about when people remix albums, you can say, oh yeah, that you can definitely tell the difference. This is not one of those that you can tell the difference too well. So that's pretty cool.
Okay.
All right. Well, that kind of wraps up our show. For as far as the EPs are concerned, there are so many EPs out there from so many different bands that we didn't even touch on. We may do a second episode on this stuff. Touching real quick on the Alice in Chains. Alice in Chains released, and they re-released this last year at Record Store Day, I think it was, or in 2023. It may have been 23, may have been 22, or Black Friday, at one of those. It was Alice in Chains, We Die Young. It was originally a promo only, and that's another thing that we didn't talk about at the beginning, where record companies have this thing where they're able to release material that is eventually going to come out from the band. They can take a song from the upcoming album, or maybe a couple songs. Maybe they'll have a B-side that was recorded from the studio that is not going on the album, so they'll put it on this. EP, and they'll put out a promotional one. It's for free. They send it to the record stores, or they'll send it to the radio stations to promote the future single or to promote the band in general. And so that's what happened with Alice in Chains. They released a song "We Die Young" as a promotional EP, and it had some songs off of the Facelift album. I believe there's one song that's not on Facelift, or it's a different version, or it's a live version or something like that. But it was pretty cool. They re-released it on Record Store Day a few years ago. It's pretty neat. AC/DC put Jailbreak out. They re-released some of the stuff that wasn't available early on. There's so many out there that it would take us 4 or 5 hours to go through everything. So we will probably do another episode on this sometime later this year. But now it's time for our big four. All right, so my big four metal EPs go like this. Number 4 for me, Twisted Sister Rough Cuts. It was the debut release from Twisted Sister on their brand new record label that they were signed to, Secret Records. So secret they went belly up later that year after they released their first album. So Rough Cuts was pretty cool. It had What You Don't Know Sure Can Hurt You, Under the Blade, Shoot 'Em Down, and a cover of the song Leader to Pack. All 4 songs would eventually make its way to later releases. 3 of them, What You Don't Know, Under the Blade, and Shoot 'Em Down, were featured on the Under the Blade album, and then Leader to Pack was later re-recorded for the Come Out and Play album. Really, really like that EP. Awesome. Number 3 for me, I mentioned it a little bit ago. It's called The Other Side from Godsmack. Love that EP. It is one of the best sounding EPs out there. It's acoustic. It's amazing. They've got a couple of new songs, and then they have a couple of acoustic versions of some of their songs. But then they put a song. I believe it's a song called "Awake." They turned it into "Asleep," and it's just a completely reimagined version of that song "Awake," which is a pretty amazing song in general, but to think of it as an acoustic song is pretty wild. And that's my number 3. Number 2 for me is Alice in Chains' Jar of Flies. We just talked about that. Love that record. Love the recording, the audio, the sonics are amazing. Mike Inez's influence was all over that record, and because he influenced the record, he also stood out with his bass playing on that. It was really, really well recorded, so you could hear everything very clearly. So that's an awesome, awesome EP. And then number 1 for me, we didn't talk about it, and it's amazing that we didn't, but it is, for me, hands down, one of the most popular EPs to ever come out. It is Metallica's The 598 EP, which was all covers of most bands that most American kids didn't know about, except for the Misfits. And it really turned a lot of people on to some really good metal. And there's not a lot I can say about that. I mean, everyone knows about the 598 EP or the 998 CD back in the day. They re-released it on Blackened Records a few years ago. And it's out there in the wild again.
Very cool.
All right. So what are your big 4?
So my number 4 is AC/DC 74 Jailbreak. So for me, I remember when I picked this up, I was really kind of learning about the differences between AC/DC's US releases and the Australian or other versions of it that were out. And I was looking to kind of complete the original versions of the albums, because in the digital era, or the early days of the digital era, you could get certain things, but it was still kind of hard to find. And I didn't realize what 74 Jailbreak was for the longest time, and I really love the song Jailbreak. And I remember just listening to, and it's not very long, track listing there, but it's 5 tracks that you couldn't get elsewhere at the time. And I loved "You Ain't Got a Hold on Me," "Baby Please Don't Go," and "Jailbreak." I liked the other 2 tracks, "Show Business" and "Soul Stripper" as well, but those were my favorites from the album of those 3. Um, but it was like, finding a hidden gem, even though people knew about it way before I did, but for me it was like, I remember finding it and just being so excited about it. And even though it's probably not as landmark as other stuff, part of it for me is the nostalgia factor and what happened at the time. Me finding it, and finding music was always kind of like hit or miss back then. So um and then my number three, I mentioned it earlier, and part of it again is that excitement at the time. Children of Bottom's Trashed, Lost, and Strung Out. I was probably way more excited about this than most people were, but um, you know, I really like the track Knuckle Duster, and I'm glad they brought it back around for that last album. But also just like I said, the videos that were on it, it was like super cool. Made me feel like a little bit more attachment to the band as well. I remember the first album also that I had. I got a re-release of it that had a video of Dead Night Warrior, and so like having those videos attached on the CDs to me was like this very like niche and nostalgic time for CD releases, and I think this kind of like rehashed some of that excitement for me. And then number two is In Flames Subterranean. Like I said earlier, like absolutely love this album. I love the vocals. It was the only one that Hank did, and I thought he sounded great within Flames. I love that lineup. I always really liked Glenn Lundstrom's guitar work. Um, Johan Larsson was there early in the band, and like for me, like when things started changing, it's always kind of weird. Like and now it's more easy to find information of it, but like back then, you're like, why did they leave the band? Why did things change? And there was this kind of mystery behind it all, and so. I was always so intrigued with band lineup changes, and I think maybe that's what drove me be interested in Black Sabbath. Uh, but but my number one, I think you had as number two, is Alice in Chains' Jar of Flies. Like I said, absolutely love that album. It's got my favorite Alice in Chains song on it, and just such a nice change of pace. Like I love the heavier stuff. Still, my favorite album of theirs is Dirt, but this is number two for me, and yeah, just really love that album.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. I really that I'm a big fan of that Jar of Flies album. I really am.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that is our big four metal EPs, and that brings a close to this episode of Debating Metal. Remember, you can listen to us just about every week on your favorite podcast platform. And if you want to see us grow, tell your friends about us and let them like or subscribe as well, because we know you have. So let them know about us. They won't be disappointed.
And don't forget, you can interact with us on Facebook, Instagram, and our new X/Twitter account at Debating MTL Pod, or send us an email to debatingmetal@gmail.com. YouTube viewers, click subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when we post a new episode. And remember, tune into the next episode where we'll spark up another exciting metal debate. On behalf of Kenneth and myself, stay safe and always turn it up to 11.
See ya.